Okay, welcome to our second unit. We're going to be talking about different research methods in this unit, so if you need to stop at any time, please do and make some notes. Notes would be a good thing, so let's get going. Alright, it is an experimental science as we talked about in the last chapter, so we have to do research, and there are 5 steps. Now this is be pretty basic. If you've taken any science classes whatsoever, you should recognize all these. Of course, you form a research question. The question could be for many different reasons, whatever random reason you might come up with. For example, why is ISS always full of kids who have their pants down around their knees? It just seems that way. I looked in there one day and they were all like that. Well, maybe that's my research question. That's a question that I'd like to know an answer to. The next thing is you come up with a guess, an educated guess called a hypothesis. You formed to answer your question. Maybe your hypothesis is that the principals are racist, I guess, if you will, or prejudiced against kids with pants around their knees. I don't know. But anyway, that could be your educated guess. Your next one would be test this hypothesis. You got to choose the most accurate test for your question. It could be a blood test. It could be an IQ test. It could be just a survey. Whatever you think is the right method, that's what you would use. The next thing is analyze your results, figure out what they mean, filter out all the unwanted data. You want to go through it, results, and let's say that they all happen to be boys. Well, maybe that's irrelevant data, so we would filter that out, get rid of it. Look at your results, see if you actually got a good set of results. The next thing would be draw your conclusions, just determine whether your hypothesis is correct or it needs to be modified. Maybe you're looking at the wrong thing. Maybe it's not that the principals are prejudiced against those kids. Maybe it's because they have bad attendance, because they walk around the halls and have to hold on to their pants to keep them up, so they're late to every class. So maybe you need to modify it, change it somehow, or redirect. The findings of a study should be confirmed. In order for that to be confirmed, you have to be able to replicate it. In other words, do it again and again and again and get the same answer. Let's say you have a mouse that runs through a maze very, very quickly after eating something. Well, maybe it just happens to be that mouse that's really smart and the rest of them are really stupid. So you got to be able to redo it over and over and over again in order to get a good study done. All right, now a survey. Now, if there are surveys everywhere. If we go to the mall, people still may stop you in the mall. They may call you on the phone. They're always asking if they call your home phone. Do you have a few minutes for a survey? There are surveys everywhere. Here at school, we've had to take time out of the day to take surveys. If you read Cosmo, there's 5 or 6 surveys and everything. Am I too fat? Is my boyfriend cheating on me? Should I, do I dress too prude? Who knows what it could be, but there's all different kinds of surveys everywhere we look. They're not always necessarily accurate. There's a couple different reasons for that. They may feel that their answers may not be kept confidential. If I were to be in class one day and take a survey and say, okay, I want everybody that has had an STD to write down what that was in the past, year or something like that. Well, people aren't going to give me a good answer to that. They know, it might not be kept confidential. I'd be worried about that thing. If you took a bunch of adults and asked them, hey, how many of you have cheated on your taxes? You're not going to get a good answer. The respondents might try to please the interviewer. They may try to, they know what the interviewer wants to hear. If my boss asks me questions about what I think about, the administration's way they deal with ID policy, I know what they want to hear, so I might try to please them. I actually probably wouldn't, but you get the idea. To conduct a survey accurately, you have to define your target population. The target population is everybody that you want to study. It's the whole group you want to study. If I want to do a survey about high school students, that's every high school student. That's millions and millions of kids. Well, it's impossible. I can never test that many kids. So I have to use a sample. It's only part of that target population. It might be a few kids from all across the country. NICSA is not necessarily a good representation of all across the country. I mean, we're 99% white. That is not what our country is made of. So samples should be as similar to this population as possible. So it should have a pretty good mix of kids in it. There are two different types. The first one is random, and as it says, it is random. People are selected totally by chance. Maybe it's by the next 5 people in the hall. Maybe it is a computer that generates something out of social security numbers, or maybe a computer just makes random phone calls, and that's who you end up with. So it can be pretty accurate if you have to choose enough people. A stratified sample is a little bit different. It proportionally represents the subgroups in the population. It's more accurate because it's got a better mix of your target population. Let's say if you're going to do this, if we're going to do high school kids, well, 47% of high school students are white. Well, that means 47 out of your 100 people that you survey need to be white. It needs to be about 23% Hispanic, about 21% African American. So these numbers have to be the same as the target population. So it's a little bit more difficult, but much more accurate. The results of your surveys should not be generalized. Just because we take a survey in our class doesn't mean that they think the same thing in Republic or in Willard or in New York City. I guarantee they don't think the same thing in New York City as we do here in Nixa. Researchers have to deal with something called a volunteer bias. It's when people who volunteer to take surveys often differ than those who don't. You think about those people who call on the phone. Who likes to talk to people on the phone at night? I don't. Chances are old people love to talk on the phone, and they usually have a certain axe to grind. They want their opinion to be heard, so that's why they're going to volunteer to do it. So they're somewhat biased. Okay, let's talk about observation methods a little bit here. A testing method is a type of observations with several types of psychological tests. You have intelligence test, aptitude test, personality test. Intelligence, you know what that is, so you're smart or not. Aptitude means what you would be good at. Some of you may have taken the ASVAB test, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. The government pays for this, the military does, and they say, oh, based on your test scores, you would be good at code breaking or whatever it happens to be. And personality tests are becoming quite common, especially with large corporations, because you have to have a good mix of people working together. If you have too many A-type personalities that are very outgoing, very opinionated, then it will not work. They'll be button heads the whole time. One of these things is called a case study. It's an in-depth investigation of an individual or small group. They're difficult and sometimes unrepeatable. It's a long-term look at a small group or individual. So let's say I do a case study on albino midgets. Well, the chances of me repeating that is very difficult. I mean, I may never see one again in my life. So it is a difficult thing to do, but they can give you a lot of information. There are two different kinds. You have a longitudinal and a cross-sectional. Your longitudinal means you follow a few people over a long period of time and you see how they change. If I want to do a longitudinal study of how Ritalin affects teenage boys, it takes quite a bit of time. You'd have to follow them from the time they're 13 to the time they're 19. So I'd go out and find 100 boys that are 13 years old, and every month I have them come back in and ask them more questions. Well, that would be incredibly accurate, but very expensive, and it's going to take me at least 7 years to do. So it's not always the best way to go. The cross-sectional method means I find different people from different stages. So I'd go out and find 100 13-year-olds, 100 14-year-olds, 100 15-year-olds, and so on and so on and so on. Much faster, but not near as accurate. It's cheap. You could do it all in a week and it wouldn't cost you that much money, but the difference between people is going to throw off your data quite a bit. Now, naturalistic observation has to deal with watching people in their natural environment. If you watch students, obviously you're going to watch them in a classroom. If you're going to watch gorillas, you go to the jungle. If you're going to watch prairie dogs, you go to the prairie. That's naturalistic observation. Laboratory is when I want to control some part of the surrounding elements. Let's say I want to watch polar bears. Well, and I want to see what happens when polar bears sweat. Well, I can go up and sit on an ice berg all day and watch the polar bears, and they may never sweat. So if I want to control part of it, I put them in a laboratory or maybe in a zoo, and I turn the heat up a little and then see what happens when they sweat. So that's when I want to control some aspect of the observation. Now, these types of studies produce something called a Hawthorne effect. It's when you act different when you know you're being watched. When my boss comes in and watches me teach, I act different. I don't want to, I don't try to, but I do anyway. If the policeman pulls up behind you while you're driving, you put both hands on the wheel. You make sure that seatbelt's buckled. You make sure your phone is somewhere beside your lap. You do everything right. You put a blinker on a quarter mile before you have to turn. It's the Hawthorne effect. You act different when you know you're being watched. There's a couple of pictures here. These are from the Hawthorne electric plant. This is up around Chicago. And what they did is they did a little study to see if lighting affected productivity. So you see the pictures on the left there. They put a bunch of women that built circuit boards all day long. That's all their job was. And they put them in a room. They had a one-way mirror on it. So they knew they were being watched, but they weren't quite sure why. Well, the first day, they have the lights turned all the way up. And they said, oh, don't worry about anything, just act normal, and just build your circuit boards like you normally do. Well, the women were in there, and they're like, something's wrong. These guys are watching us. We need to speed up. So the next day they come back, the lights are a little dimmer, not that you would notice, because from day to day you wouldn't really notice that much, but they start working faster. So by the end of the week, they're working faster than they ever have, and they're producing these things, and it totally destroyed their whole study because they knew they were being watched. So it's a Hawthorne electric plant. It was a massive plant for General Motors. They built all kinds of electrical engines and circuits and all kinds of stuff, and actually it was so big it even had its own railroad going from plant to plant. So very, very, very large. Alright, now what do you do with this information? Once you get it, you look for a correlation. That means that how closely one thing is related to another. Could be a positive correlation, could be a negative correlation. If it's positive, one goes up, the other goes up. Well, if the amount you study goes up, your grades go up. That's a positive correlation. Now, it could move in a negative direction. As the temperature goes down, the amount we sweat goes down. Still a positive correlation because they move in the same direction, but it just happens to be a negative aspect to it. Alright? If it's negative, one goes up, the other goes down, so they move in opposite directions. The amount of studying you do goes up, the amount of sleep you get goes down. That is a negative correlation, so they move in opposite directions. Just because there's a correlation between two things doesn't mean one causes the other. So correlation does not mean causation. For example, if the more you study, the more schooling you have or more education, the better your grades. I'm sorry, doesn't make sense. The more you study, the more money you make. The more education you have, the more money you make. Now, there's a correlation between that, but that does not mean one causes the other. Not true at all. There's a lot of people out there who have a lot of schooling that don't make much money. It all depends on what kind of job you get. All right? Experimentation. Researchers use an experiment to determine cause and effect, and every experiment contains variables. Now, this is probably a repeat of a lot of science stuff you had there, so we're going to blow through this relatively quickly. An independent variable is a factor the researcher can manipulate so they can determine their effect. So if I have 4 plants, I put fertilizer on 2 of them. The amount of fertilizer I put on there is my independent variable. The dependent variable is how much the plant grows. Okay, it depends on the independent variable. Alright, example, if I want to see if temperature has anything to do with the sleepiness, temperature would be independent, sleepiness would be dependent. Alright, now the best one uses a control group. You have to have a control group. In other words, something that nothing gets messed with. The experimental group receives the treatment. So if I have 4 plants, 2 of them get fertilizer. The 2 that get the fertilizer are the experimental group. The control group doesn't receive anything. Otherwise, you can't tell if you don't have a control group what actually happened. And we'll continue this in a few moments on the next one.